Okay, next I want to add this sort of link drawer that should appear underneath the navbar when you click the menu button to open it up. So same approach as we took before. I think the first thing we should do is just add a bunch of the markup and then style it after the fact. So after this div where the button is, I'm going to add a new div that can hold all of these links, and then I'm going to drop in a few links. So we'll just make them go nowhere for now, and we'll just kind of make up some places they could go. Since this is Workcation, like a site where you can sort of list properties that people can take workations at or rent properties to go to for a workation, maybe we have some categories like list your property, or maybe something like trips for the trips that you've booked, or maybe like messages for talking with the host, kind of like Airbnb-ish. So let's just save this and see what we get and figure out what we have to do next. Okay, so you can see things jumped around a little bit and you can't quite see it, but if you look, actually, we do have a couple of links hiding here on the right. Now, obviously, we want these links to appear below, so let's figure out the best way to do that. I think the easiest approach would be to just add an extra wrapper div around this content so we can make this a flex container and have this div appear underneath. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to duplicate this header, and I'm going to duplicate the closing tag as well. And I'm going to move the closing tag up here since we want it to wrap this content. We'll sort of outdent this stuff. Instead of making this one a header, we'll just make this a div. And then we'll move around a few of these classes. So the header shouldn't be flex anymore, so let's get rid of this stuff. And I think the padding should also live on this element since this is the one at the top that has the logo and the button, so we'll get rid of that. But the background color we will keep here because I think I want to use the background color for the entire thing. So that means we can get rid of the background color here, and with any luck, this should look a little bit better. Okay, so now we actually have the links below. Kind of hard to see, but if we highlight them, you can see it. But we want these to probably be like stacked on top of each other. So I think what I'm going to do is I'm going to make each one of these links display block instead of display inline like they are by default, and that'll cause them to stack. So I'm just going to use multiple cursors here so we can add some classes to these links all at once. So we'll just go with display block so things stack. I think we probably want the text to be a little easier to read than being the same color as the background color. So why don't we go ahead and make the text white for these links as well. And I think maybe we'll use like a slightly fatter font, like a higher font weight. So why don't we go with maybe like font semi-bold? Yeah, I think that actually looks kind of nice. The spacing is a little bit off, so let's kind of figure that out. We don't want these going all the way to the left edge. We probably want it to sort of feel more like the same padding that we have for the top part of the navbar. So why don't we start by just adding some padding to this container. So why don't we do px4 to match the padding that we had up here. And that looks a little bit better, but I think we also need some vertical padding. So why don't we try just doing something like PY3, just like we had on the nav bar at the top. See what that looks like. I think this actually doesn't look too bad at the bottom, but we do have a lot more padding than necessary at the top. So why don't we split this up? Maybe we'll do like PT2 and like PB3. See what that looks like. And actually, you know what? Let's add a little bit more bottom padding. Let's go with like PB4 at the bottom. So now we have the same amount on the left as we do at the bottom. I think this looks okay. Things still look a little bit tight though, and I think that's actually the space between each one of these links that I don't really love. So before we get into sort of fine tuning the space between each one, I want to think through like what our hover state is going to be because that might affect what we do here. So right now you can see you just get like the cursor, but no sort of visual indicator in the UI itself that these are actually links. A treatment that I kind of like is to do like a background color. So maybe when you hover it, you get sort of like a soft gray kind of background. So it just kind of looks hovered. So why don't we try adding that and see what it looks like. So maybe for each one of these, we'll do something like hover BG gray 800. Since we're using 900 for the main background, 800 is kind of the next step up. So this is sort of as subtle as we can go. I think in general, this actually looks pretty good. I don't like the square corners though. So why don't we add rounded corners on hover? So we can just add rounded corners all the time since they're not visible except when you're on hover. And that looks a little bit better, but I don't really love how the text goes all the way to the left edge. So I think we should add some horizontal padding to each one of these links. So why don't we try something like PX2 and see what that looks like. So I think that actually looks pretty good for the links themselves, but I don't like how the text doesn't line up with this left edge anymore. So why don't we subtract the padding that we added to each link from the container. So instead of doing px4, we'll do px2 here so that this 2 plus this 2 equals the 4 above. And yeah, I think that's actually starting to look a little bit better. I think we could probably add a little bit of vertical padding too, maybe just like the minimum amount, like py1, see what that looks like. Yeah, and this is starting to look a little bit better, I think. Now, right now, these are stacked kind of directly on top of each other, so you can see there's like no space between the links as I move my mouse cursor up and down. This is sort of a judgment call. You could go either way, I think, in terms of having a tiny bit of space or just having them stacked right on top of each other. I think I like the idea of having a little bit of space, so I'm going to add maybe MT1 here. And yeah, now you can see we've got a little bit of space between each one, which is kind of nice, and we've got quite a lot of room to breathe here. We don't actually need the margin top on the first one, since there's nothing to sort of push it away from, so let's remove that. And yeah, I think what we have here actually looks pretty nice. So final step, I think, is to get this drawer sort of opening and closing when we hit this button. So this isn't really a Tailwind thing. We're going to do this in Vue.js, but I think it's useful to sort of see how we're going to do that and what Tailwind classes we're going to toggle and stuff like that. So the first thing I'm going to do is add a piece of state to our Vue component here called isOpen. We'll set that to false by default, and this will just track, whether or not the menu is actually open. So if the menu is closed, then we actually don't want to show this section, right? So let's add a conditional class here using Vue. So we'll say if isOpen is true, then we want to set this to display block, which is the default for divs, so that's visible. Otherwise, we want to use hidden and set it to display none. So now you can see that by default it's hidden. If we toggle this to true, it should refresh and be open. Yeah. So next, let's make the actual button trigger this toggling. So really easy to do. I'm just going to add an @click here, and I'm just going to say whenever someone clicks this button, isOpen should become the opposite of whatever it already is. So now if we go ahead and click this button, we should see that, yeah, it works. Now one tiny change that we could make, right now this hamburger icon stays as a hamburger icon even when it's open. I think it'd be nice if it changed to an X when it's open. So I have another SVG icon for an X in the clipboard that I'm just going to paste in here. So what I've actually done is I've just copied the path because the actual SVG sort of wrapper element had the same view box, and we're going to use the same size and the same color and stuff because we don't want things to jump around. So because SVG is just HTML, we can actually just swap out the path inside the SVG instead of swapping out the entire SVG. So what we want to do is this one is the X, so we want to show this one whenever the menu is closed, and we want to show this one whenever the menu is open. So let's just say vif is open. So if isOpen is true, then that means we want to show the X so that you can close it. And if isOpen is false, so if not isOpen, then we want to show the hamburger menu icon. So now if I go ahead and click this, you'll see it turns into an X, and when I click the X, it turns back into the hamburger menu icon. So there you go. We've made this toggleable. Inside of it, we've got these links. We've got some nice hover states and stuff like that. And in the next lesson, we're actually going to work on making this properly responsive so that we can show these links up in the nav bar once we actually have room for them to fit.